Sign it." Sophie slid the divorce agreement across the kitchen table toward me, her voice so flat it could have been a corporate memo. She wore that cream-colored cashmere coat, her hair swept up in a perfect twist, her whole appearance polished to a cold, unfamiliar gloss. But I knew her too well. Knew her well enough to see the thin, crumbling thing beneath the surface, the tremor in her lashes, the bloodless pinch of her lips where that dusty rose lipstick had been applied with such care, the way her interlocked fingers pressed so hard the knuckles went white. She was pouring every ounce of herself into looking unaffected. But Sophie had never been a good actress, not with me. I didn't argue, didn't ask why, didn't fall to my knees and beg her to stay the way she'd braced herself for. I just picked up the pen and signed my name at the bottom of the final page. Ethan Lynn, clean and legible, the way I'd signed every bank check and school permission slip for the past 8 years. Then I slid it back. "Your turn." She froze. The color drained from her face in a single, sickening rush, and when the tears came, they came with no warning, no build-up. "You're not even going to ask? You don't want Leo? You don't want this family?" I said, "You want your freedom. I'm giving it to you." 3 hours later, we were in the waiting area of the county clerk's office. She was crouched in front of me, clutching the freshly stamped divorce certificate, her mascara smeared into dark rivulets down her cheeks. Her nails dug into the back of my hand as she demanded to know why I'd let go so easily, why I hadn't fought, why I hadn't even tried to stop her. So I told her. "I'm checking into the hospital next week. They found a tumor in my stomach. We don't know yet if it's malignant." The sound of her crying stopped like someone had cut a wire. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Light poured through the glass ceiling above us, falling across her bloodless face, and I watched her fingers loosen and tighten around the certificate, over and over, like she'd forgotten how to let go of anything. When she finally looked up, her swollen eyes held everything: horror, regret, a grief that had nothing to do with the divorce. She understood then. He wasn't indifferent, he just refused to use his illness to trap her. He'd made the decision for her, shouldered every consequence alone, handed her the last shred of dignity she had left, and then he'd turned and walked into that elevator, into surgery, into a spring she would never be part of. The rain started on the afternoon of December 29th, just a thin grey drizzle that streaked the kitchen windows like tears on a windshield. I came home at 6:40 to find the living room lit only by the floor lamp in the corner. That warm amber glow I'd picked out myself, the one Sophie had said made the whole room feel like a coffee shop. She was curled on the sofa, a fashion magazine open on her lap, but she wasn't reading it. Her eyes were fixed on the TV, where some game show was playing to an audience of canned laughter. She wasn't laughing, she wasn't even smiling. Her face was as blank as a page that had been erased too many times. I bent to change my shoes and noticed her white heels lying in a tangle by the door, one on its side, the other half hidden under the shoe rack. Sophie always lined her shoes up straight, even when she was exhausted. Always. "Where's Leo?" I asked, hanging my coat. "In his room, doing homework." She didn't look up. Her voice was like watered-down tea. I walked past the coffee table and saw a courier envelope lying there, already opened, a corner of paper visible inside. The edges were creased from being picked up and put down, picked up and put down. I didn't stop to look. I went to the kitchen, rolled up my sleeves, and started washing my hands. The fridge held a bunch of greens, a sea bass I'd bought the day before, and half a block of tofu. I decided on steamed fish with ginger and scallions, stir-fried lettuce with oyster sauce, and a simple seaweed and egg drop soup. Leo loved fish. Sophie loved soup. After 8 years of cooking for them, I'd memorized every preference like a worn-out recipe card. Even with Sophie working late more and more over the past 6 months, I still kept dinner warm and waiting. The range hood hummed to life. Garlic sizzled in the wok, and the steamer began to bubble. I was slicing green onions when I heard Sophie get up from the sofa, her footsteps crossing the hardwood to the hallway, then the soft creak of Leo's door opening. "Almost done?" Her voice carried down the hall. "2 more problems," Leo's voice muffled. "Finish up and wash your hands." Her footsteps retreated, but not to the sofa. She'd stopped somewhere in the hallway, leaning against the wall. I stirred the vegetables, watching the steam fog the window above the sink. Outside, the city was already dark, the opposite building lit up like a checkerboard of warm yellow squares. Leo burst from his room a few minutes later, skidding into the kitchen doorway. "Dad, teacher said I got 100 on my math test. Only 2 kids in the whole class got 100. I turned, spatula still in hand, and grinned. "That's my boy, extra fish for you tonight." He beamed, showing off the gap where his 2 front teeth used to be. Then he bolted for the bathroom, singing some nonsense song he'd picked up from a cartoon. I set the table, filled the rice bowls. Sophie drifted in slowly and sat down, picking up her chopsticks with the mechanical precision of someone completing a task. She took a single stem of lettuce and chewed it in slow motion, like she was counting each bite. Leo, on the other hand, attacked his food like a small wolf, narrating the dramatic story of his math victory, as if a 2-digit subtraction problem were a feat of Olympian proportion. I ladled soup into Sophie's bowl and set it beside her hand. "Work's been heavy, hasn't it? Once your year-end bonus comes through, you should take a few days off. Rest up." She wrapped her fingers around the bowl, flinching at the heat, and murmured, Then she stared into the soup, stirring it with her spoon, not drinking. After dinner, I cleared the dishes, while Sophie bathed Leo. Through the bathroom door, I could hear splashing and his high-pitched laughter. He was probably flooding the floor again. I stood at the sink, scrubbing the wok with a steel wool pad, and my eyes drifted to the coffee table. From this angle, through the torn opening of the courier envelope, I could see a bold line of text, something that looked like agreement. I felt a small tug in my chest, but I kept scrubbing. By the time I'd wiped down the counter, Sophie had tucked Leo in. His door was ajar, a sliver of nightlight glowing through. I could hear her soft voice reading a bedtime story. Something about a little rabbit finding its way home. Her voice was gentle, but the edges were frayed with exhaustion. I went into the bedroom. Sophie was at the vanity, dabbing night cream onto her face in front of the mirror. She wore an old cotton nightgown, loose at the collar, showing the sharp line of her collarbones. Her hair fell loose, hiding half her face. In the mirror, her reflection wore an expression I couldn't quite name, something distant, guarded. I came up behind her and put my hands lightly on her shoulders. "You've lost weight. After your bonus hits, let's take a few days and go somewhere. Maybe that hot spring resort Leo's been asking about." She went still, just for a second. Then she relaxed, but not into me. "We'll see." "What's wrong? Are you feeling sick?" "No, just tired." I stepped away and moved to the window. Across the street, someone's balcony was strung with Christmas lights, blinking red and gold. Below, a solitary walker hurried through the rain, his shadow stretching long under the street lamp. "Sophie," I said. "Yeah?" "You've got something on your mind." Her hand paused mid-stroke. In the mirror, her eyes met mine, and for just a moment, I saw something skitter across them. Panic, maybe. Then it was gone, smoothed over like a ripple disappearing back into still water. "No, you're imagining things." I didn't push. She'd always been like that. When she didn't want to talk, you couldn't pry it out of her with a crowbar. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to the rhythm of her breathing beside me. She was on her side, facing away, her body curled tight as a fist. The streetlight bled through the blinds, painting a pale stripe across her shoulder. I knew she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too deliberate, too careful. Every few minutes it would catch, like she was swallowing something she didn't want to let out. Around 2 a.m, she shifted. Her fingers brushed my back, so light, like a feather falling, and then withdrew. I pretended to be asleep. But my chest felt like someone had reached inside, and I pursued her for 2 years. I wrote letters, brought her breakfast, played guitar under her dorm window. On her birthday, I arranged candles in a giant heart shape on the quad. She turned me down, over and over. "We're not right for each other. I'm focused on grad school. I'm not dating." But I didn't quit. I asked her to study with me at the library. I accidentally ran into her at campus events. Then, in our senior year, winter came. It snowed so hard that night the ground turned white within an hour. She was waiting under the awning of the humanities building, her coat pulled tight, watching the snow fall. I walked up with my black umbrella and said, "Let me walk you back." She looked at me, said nothing, but she stepped under the umbrella. We walked through the snow, the crunch of it under our shoes the only sound. By the time we reached her dormitory, the snow was up to our ankles. She pulled her scarf higher and said, "Ethan, why do you try so hard?" I said, "Because I want to." She was quiet for a long time. Then, almost too soft to hear, "Will you keep trying? Forever?" It was the most vulnerable thing she'd ever said to me. I scooped her up in the snow and spun her around, and she shrieked and laughed and shoved her icy hands down the back of my collar. After graduation, we stayed in the city. She took a copywriting job at an ad agency. I went into operations at a tech company. Money was tight. We rented a tiny room in the old district, barely 100 square feet, so hot in summer it was like living in a steam bath. We had one ancient fan that rattled on its stand. We'd lie on the single bed, her sweating into my shoulder, and I'd fan her with a cardboard box and tell her, "One day we'll have a big place, air conditioning, a dog." She'd laugh with her eyes closed. "And a baby." We got the house. We got the dog, though we gave it away after 6 months to a friend who could actually walk it. And we got Leo. When Sophie went into labor, she was in delivery for 14 hours. I stayed outside the door, listening to her call my name through the pain. When the nurse brought Leo out, Sophie looked at him, exhausted and pale, and said, "He has your face." The way she looked at me then, there was light in it. But somewhere along the way, that light dimmed. I think it started when she became a project manager. The hours got longer, her phone never stopped ringing. I'd make dinner and wait, and she'd come in and say, "Already ate," and disappear into her home office to answer emails. On weekends, she'd sleep in while I took Leo to the park. By the time we got back, she'd still be in bed. Our conversations shrank, from "How was your day?" to "Ming, okay, got it." Sometimes Leo would tug her hand and say, "Mum, play with me," and she'd pat his head and say, "Mum's tired. Go play with Dad." I tried, once. One weekend evening, after Leo was asleep, I poured her a glass of wine and sat beside her on the sofa. "Sophie," I said, "we don't really talk anymore." She swirled the glass, watching the city lights beyond the window. "It's just a busy season. Once this project wraps up." But one project wrapped up and another began. There was never an end. 3 months before the divorce papers, I saw a message pop up on her phone. The sender was saved as Derek. The preview read, "I really enjoyed dinner Saturday. Looking forward to next time." I didn't click on it, but that name lodged itself in me like a splinter. Then I noticed she'd started taking calls on the balcony, voice low, sometimes laughing. A light, easy laugh I hadn't heard in years. When she did, she'd twist the red agate bracelet on her wrist, the one she always wore when she was nervous or happy. On my birthday, she said she had to work late. I took Leo out for noodles. On the way home, we passed a steakhouse downtown. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw Sophie sitting across from a man I recognized as Derek Joe, her company's VP. She was wearing the cream sweater I'd bought her last Christmas, her hair loose, cutting into a steak with a smile on her face. That same smile I'd watched drain away over the years. I stood across the street for a long time. Long enough for the takeout bag I was holding to slip from my hand and hit the pavement with a wet slap. I didn't go in. I didn't call. I just picked up the bag and took Leo home. Sophie got back that night after 11, smelling faintly of wine and perfume. She saw me sitting on the sofa and blinked. "You're still up." "Waiting for you." She didn't answer, just changed and got into bed. After that night, something in me loosened. Not broke, loosened. I knew what was happening. I knew something was slipping away, but I didn't have the strength to pull it back. Maybe I was too tired. Maybe I'd known, on some level, that it had already gone. December 30th, 7:15 in the morning. I woke to find Sophie already dressed and seated at the kitchen table. She'd put on the cream cashmere coat, twisted her hair into an immaculate knot, and touched up her makeup with precision. Her lips were that dusty rose shade she always wore to professional meetings. It was Saturday. She didn't work Saturdays. Leo was still asleep. I could hear his soft snoring through the wall. The apartment was quiet, the curtains barely pulled back, letting in a pewter-grey light. 2 glasses of warm milk and a plate of cut fruit sat on the table, apple slices, orange wedges, arranged like a hotel breakfast. I pulled out a chair, reached for an apple slice, and crunched into it. "What's the plan today? Want to take Leo to that new indoor playground? My colleague said it's great." Sophie didn't answer. Her hands were clasped on the table, her eyes fixed somewhere below her line of sight. She was gathering herself for something heavy. Then she reached beside her chair and lifted a thick manila envelope, placing it on the table between us. It was sealed, but the edges were soft and creased. She'd handled it many times. On the front, a printed label. Astor's Ethan Lynn. "What's this?" I set down the apple and wiped my fingers. "Open it." Her voice was too level, too controlled, like the surface of a lake hiding a riptide underneath. I tore the seal. Inside, a stack of papers neatly printed. Bold text at the top. Divorce agreement. Astal. I went still for a moment. Then I turned the pages, one by one. Asset division, child custody, visitation rights, spousal support, every detail accounted for. This wasn't impulsive. This had been drafted, revised, probably run past a lawyer. My eyes stopped at the custody clause. Asdales, the minor child, Leo Lynn, shall be placed in the sole custody of the mother, Sophie Sue. The father, Ethan Lynn, shall not be required to pay child support, but shall be entitled to visitation twice per month, to be mutually agreed upon. I looked at Sophie. She sat with her back straight as a ruler, her hands clasped so hard her knuckles were white. Her gaze was steady, almost cold, but I knew her too well. Her lashes fluttered. That tiny, tells everything flutter she'd done before every big presentation in college. "Why?" I asked. My own voice surprised me, steady, almost neutral. "We don't love each other anymore." She spoke like she'd rehearsed this, every syllable placed with care. "I've been thinking about this for more than 6 months. We're just roommates now, not husband and wife. Staying like this, it's not fair to you, to me, or to Leo. I've thought about it a lot, and this is the best decision." "6 months?" I repeated. "So since you started working all those extra hours, you were already considering this?" She bit her lip. "Yes." "Planning your exit." "Ethan, that's not what I was doing." Her voice sharpened, just a fraction. "I was trying to find a way out for both of us. Staying like this, it's only going to make us more miserable." I set the document down and got up to pour myself a glass of water. I drank slowly, letting the cold run down my throat. Outside, the clouds were breaking apart, letting in a stripe of pale blue. A shaft of sunlight fell across the table, landing on Sophie's shoulder, gilding her collar. She used to sit in the university library, just like that, sunlight pooling around her, her head bent over a book, making everything else in the room fade to grey. I'd sit across from her, pretending to study, watching her instead. "Sophie," I said, "are you sure you want Leo full-time? Your job, you travel, you work late. Can you give him the attention he needs?" "I've rearranged my work. My mum's agreed to move in and help with school drop-offs. I'll turn down any projects that require long-distance travel." She'd thought of everything, planned it all. "And you? Would you be happy?" That caught her off guard. She blinked, something shifting in her eyes. Finally, "I just think neither of us is happy. Stretching this out, it's not good for Leo." I picked the agreement up again and turned to the final page. There were our names, printed in advance, a blank space beside each. I stared at that space for a long time. Images flickered through my mind. The night she first told me she was pregnant, me staying up all night Googling prenatal vitamins, Leo's first word, "Mama," and Sophie crying with joy. A fever I'd had last year, her taking a day off to make me porridge that burned at the bottom, but was still the most comforting thing I'd ever eaten. Tiny, fragile pieces of our story, each one a shard of coloured glass. "I'll sign," I said. Sophie's head snapped up. For an instant, shock flashed across her face, naked and unmistakable. Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. She'd expected me to argue, to beg, to fight, maybe even to rage, but I just uncapped my pen and signed, clean and steady, Ethan Lynn Arstic, the scratch of the nib loud in the silent kitchen. I capped the pen and pushed the document back. "Your turn." She stared at my signature. Several seconds passed. Then, slowly, she picked up her own pen. Her hand was shaking. She touched the tip to the paper, smudging a tiny black dot, and then pressed down. Sophie Sue. Her usual neat hand, but the final stroke of her last name was uneven, wavering. "You're not even going to ask?" Her eyes were reddening. "You're just letting me go? Leo? This whole family? You don't want any of it?" I put down the pen and interlaced my fingers on the table. "Sophie, you asked. I'm respecting that. You wrote the terms, you set the conditions, and I'm not going to fight you on them. You want Leo. I trust you to raise him well. You want your freedom. I'm giving it to you." "Then why?" Her voice cracked. "Why won't you fight for me? Why won't you tell me to stay?" I was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind nudged the clothes rack on the balcony, metal hangers clinking softly. "On your birthday," I said, "I saw you at that steakhouse, you and Derek Joe. You were cutting a steak, and you were smiling. the kind of smile I haven't seen in years. Her face went white, bloodless. You saw that? I saw it, but I didn't come in and I didn't call. I took Leo home and waited until you came back at 11. You smelled like wine and like her perfume, and you didn't say a word. From that night on, I knew. Some things were already over. The first tears spilled over her cheeks, silent and fast. One dropped onto the agreement, blooming into a dark circle on the paper. Ethan, I'm sorry. Don't be. I pushed the tissue box toward her. People have the right to choose what makes them happy. You chose him. You chose a different path. I don't blame you, but I'm not going to use our child to trap you, and I'm not going to use our marriage to guilt you. You want to leave? I'll let you leave. She sobbed into her hands, her shoulders heaving. I sat across from her, watching. Something in my chest had shattered, but it wasn't bleeding, just hollow. When she finally quieted, I stood. Let's go do it today. I checked. The county clerk's office is open Saturday mornings. She looked up, mascara smeared, eyes swollen, but she nodded. Okay. What about Leo? I'll call my mum. Her mother lived in the next building and arrived within 10 minutes. When she came through the door and saw both of us collecting our papers and IDs, she looked from Sophie to me, her brow furrowed. But she didn't ask. She just led Leo into his bedroom and quietly closed the door. I heard Leo's voice from inside. Grandma, where are Mum and Dad going? Just out for a bit. Let's watch cartoons. I put on my jacket, laced my shoes. Sophie repaired her makeup. You could still see the redness around her eyes, and we walked out the door. In the elevator, we stood side by side, saying nothing. The floor numbers counted down, 18, 17, 16. When we stepped outside, the December wind hit us, dry and biting. My instinct was to take off my coat and wrap it around her, but I stopped myself halfway. We weren't married anymore. In an hour, even the legal tie would be severed. The sky was a sharp, cold blue, cloudless. We got into our separate cars, her white Golf and my old Toyota, and drove out of the lot. At the first red light, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw her behind me, looking down at her phone, her expression lost in the glare of the windshield. The County Services Building was a grey square block in the East End, flag flying at the entrance. The marriage licence office was on the 3rd floor. Hallways were full of young couples in love, filling out forms for the opposite counter. They were everything we weren't, smiling, flushed, fingers interlaced. One girl in a pink puffer jacket clutched a dozen red roses, while her boyfriend whispered something that turned his ears pink. We approached the window marked Divorce. The clerk was a woman in her 40s with black-rimmed glasses. She glanced over us with practiced disinterest and slid forms across the counter. Fill these out. Both parties consenting? Property and custody resolved? Resolved, Sophie said. The clerk matched our IDs, our marriage certificate, the divorce agreement. When she got to the custody clause, she looked up at me. You're waiving custody, is that correct? Yes. She turned to Sophie. And you're accepting? Yes. She pointed to a side door. Mediation room. You'll speak with a counsellor first. The room was small, with a round table and 3 plastic chairs. A sign on the wall read, East Astris, Marriage and Family Mediation. Asta, a potted pothos in the corner, had drooping leaves. The mediator was a middle-aged man in a navy jacket with gentle, practiced eyes. He sat us down and walked through the questions. How long have you been married? 8 years, Sophie said. Any children? A son. 6. That's young, he sighed. Are you sure you've thought this through? Divorce affects children in ways you can't always predict. Sophie looked down. I said, we're sure. Any infidelity? Financial issues? In-law conflict? Sophie's lashes flickered, her lips pressed together. I answered for her. No specific reason. We just fell out of love. He tried a few more lines. Reconsider. A marriage is precious fruit, and we both listened politely. Then he filled out a form, had us sign it, and directed us back to the window. The clerk typed for a few minutes. The printer hummed. Out came 2 books, bound in red, stamped in gold. They looked identical to marriage certificates, but the text on the cover read, Certificate of Divorce. Asked us. She handed one to each of us. I opened mine. Inside were 2 photos, one of each of us, the same photos we'd taken for our marriage license 8 years ago. That day, we'd stood in a tiny photo booth, her cheek pressed to my shoulder, both of us grinning like we'd won a prize. Now, the photos were separate, with a line between them. Sophie took her copy. She looked down at it, running her thumb over the gold lettering, over and over. Her fingers were trembling. All done, the clerk said. I wish you both the best. I nodded, said thank you, and turned to leave. Sophie's heels clicked behind me, but the rhythm was off, stumbling. The main hall was bustling. People at every window, the loudspeaker droning numbers, children running between the benches. Sunlight poured through a massive glass ceiling, turning everything bright and impersonal. I was heading for the elevator when I realized Sophie's footsteps had stopped. I turned. She was standing maybe 20 feet back, clutching the red certificate, her face drained of color. Her eyes were fixed on something past my shoulder, and her mouth was slightly open, like she'd forgotten how to close it. What's wrong? I walked back. She didn't answer. I followed her gaze. A woman in a dark puffer jacket, carrying a thermal bag, was standing near the elevator. It was Manager Wang, Sophie's supervisor from work. Wang spotted us and hurried over. Sophie, I've been trying to reach you. Your phone's off. Her eyes landed on the certificate in Sophie's hand. A brief flicker, quickly covered. She leaned in and murmured something in Sophie's ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I watched Sophie's face cycle through colors, pale, then flushed, then ashen. She swayed, and I caught her arm without thinking. Her skin was cold, her pulse skittering. Wang pulled back, gave me a look I couldn't read, sympathy maybe, or regret, and patted Sophie's shoulder before walking away. Sophie stood there, rooted. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were glassy, her voice cracked. Ethan. Yeah? Why? Why did you agree so fast? You asked. But you didn't fight. You didn't argue. You just, let me take Leo, let me go. Did you already want this? Did you want out too? I let out a slow breath. Sophie, you wrote the agreement. You set the terms. I just agreed to them. Isn't that what you wanted? But you never give in that easily. Before, you always pushed back, always asked questions, always made me talk it through. This time, you signed and walked out. What's going on inside your head? People were glancing at us. A young mother holding a baby gave us a curious look. I tilted my head toward the seating area. Let's sit. We lowered onto the plastic chairs. She set the certificate on her lap, clutching it so tightly the edges wrinkled. She was trying hard not to cry, but her shoulders kept hitching. I leaned back, gazed up at the glass ceiling, and spoke softly. When I saw you with Derek Zhou that night, I understood something. Marriage takes 2 people. If one of them wants to leave, the other can't hold on without making it worse for both. You wanted your freedom. I gave it. You wanted Leo. I trusted you to be a good mother. I still do. Then why? She lifted her red-rimmed eyes to me. You kept the house, split the savings, but you didn't even try to keep Leo. Are you hiding something from me? I was quiet for a few beats. The air smelled faintly of floor disinfectant. Across the room, a young couple was getting their wedding photos taken, laughing so hard they couldn't hold still. I'm checking into the hospital next week, I said. She froze. Like a video paused mid-frame. Routine physical last month. The gastroscopy showed something, a tumor in my stomach. They don't know yet if it's benign or malignant. They want to operate. I was going to wait until after New Year's, after your bonus came in, after Leo's winter break. I didn't want to put all this on you before the holidays. A tumor? Her voice came out a shriek, loud enough to turn heads. She crouched in front of me, grabbing both my hands. What kind of tumor? How bad? Why didn't you tell me earlier? Why would you keep something this big from me? I was going to tell you after the new year, but then you put the divorce papers on the table. I looked down at her fingers, gripping mine so hard her nails left crescent marks. Telling you now, or not telling you, it doesn't change the outcome. Did you? The tears came faster, hot against my knuckles. Did you sign on purpose? To make me feel guilty for the rest of my life? No. I pulled one hand free and placed it on her shoulder. Sophie, I'm not trying to punish you. I just didn't want to trap you with my illness. If I'd told you, you might have stayed out of pity, out of obligation, but the part of you that wanted to leave would still be there. You'd be miserable. I didn't want that for you. She was sobbing openly now, makeup running, mascara bleeding like black rain. I handed her a tissue from my pocket, and she took it, pressing it to her face. Who'll take care of you during the surgery? Her voice was thick, wet. My mum's flying in. She'll be here the day after tomorrow. I can take leave. No. I cut her off gently. You're not my wife anymore. The certificate is signed. You showing up to hold my hand, it would just make things confusing. Sophie, you focus on Leo. If the operation goes well, I'll come see you both. If it doesn't, just tell him Dad went away on a long trip. She looked up, eyes wild with fear. Don't say that. You're going to be fine. You have to be fine. I smiled and stood. I should go. Drive safe. Don't cry on the road. She rose too, still clutching the red certificate, and suddenly the words burst out of her. Ethan, what if I take it back? I stopped, turned. She was standing at the edge of light and shadow, half her face lit by the glass ceiling, half lost in shade. Her expression was a tangle of remorse, fear, longing, and something else I couldn't read. What do you mean? I mean, if I don't want this anymore, if we cancel the certificate and try again. The loudspeaker played a cheerful chime, the hourly signal, a tinny piano riff of Fur Elise. Sunlight fell in a warm rectangle between us, dust motes floating through it like tiny stars. I looked at her for a long time, watched the hope in her eyes flicker and dim. Then I shook my head slowly. Sophie, some doors don't open both ways. The certificate is signed. That's done. You need to move forward, and so do I. She bit her lip so hard, it must have hurt. More tears, but this time she didn't plead. She just stood there, watching me walk to the elevator. I pressed the button. The doors slid open, empty. I stepped inside and pressed 1. In the final sliver of closing space, I saw Sophie's silhouette, still standing in the middle of the hall, light streaming around her, but unable to reach her face. The elevator descended. I leaned against the cool metal wall, closed my eyes, and breathed in once, deep and slow, then out. The hollow place in my chest was scabbing over, one layer at a time. My phone buzzed. I pulled it out, a text from my mum. "Flight's booked. I'll be there the day after tomorrow. Don't worry, Mum's here." "Don't worry, Mum's here." I typed back, "Thank you. Thank you." Then I composed another text to Leo's teacher. "Starches, Ms. Zhang, I'll be traveling for work starting next week. Please contact Leo's mother for any school matters. Apologies for the inconvenience. Asda." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened, and December's cold wind swept in, catching my coat. I stepped out into that bright, harsh sunlight. I didn't look back. The next day, I started packing. The apartment had been ours for 5 years, 3 bedrooms, 2 living rooms, a kitchen we'd renovated together. We'd picked the sofa at IKEA. Sophie chose the curtains, pale blue with white shears. Leo's room was wallpapered with cartoon trains. Dishes from 2 sets, mixed together in the cabinets. All of it, every laugh, every ordinary morning, was just wait now. I called a friend in real estate and listed the place. He was surprised. "Ethan, isn't this your home? Why sell?" "Downsizing," I said. He didn't push. Adults know when not to ask. I found a small studio near the hospital, 1 bedroom, 1 living area, cheap furniture, but quiet. Single-door fridge, top-loading washer, a TV that got 1 channel. I moved my clothes, my computer, a few books. The rest went into storage. The whole move took 1 afternoon, because I didn't own much. My mum arrived the day after. She was calmer than I'd expected. No tears, no questions. She just unpacked my things, hung my clothes, bought pork ribs and lotus root from the market, and made soup. Only at night, when I got up for water, would I catch her red-eyed, saying in her most controlled voice, "It'll be okay, Mum's here." Pre-op tests took a full day. Blood work, CT scan, ECG, and the gastroscopy. That was the worst. A tube down the throat, sliding into the stomach, twisting. I lay on the table, tears streaming involuntarily, not from pain, but from the body's instinctive rebellion. Afterward, I sat in the recovery area, looking out at an old ginkgo tree, shedding yellow leaves in the wind. Last autumn, Leo had collected the biggest, brightest leaf from a tree just like that one, insisting it was for his mother's bookmark. Sophie had smiled and tucked it into her notebook. That notebook was probably still on her desk. The surgeon, Dr. Chen, was a man in his early 50s with wire-rimmed glasses. He pointed at the CT images and spoke slowly. "The mass is near the gastric antrum, about 1 inch in diameter, smooth margins, regular shape, likely benign. But because of the location, if it grows, it could obstruct digestion. We recommend partial gastrectomy, remove the affected portion, preserve most of the stomach. Full recovery is expected." "Could it be malignant?" I asked. He paused. "The imaging doesn't suggest it, but we'll only know for sure after pathology. In the meantime, stay positive." I nodded. My family had a history of cancer on both sides, so I'd always known the risk, but worrying wouldn't change anything. Surgery was scheduled for the 3rd day after New Year's. I checked in the day before, private room, white walls, white sheets, a tiny potos on the nightstand. My mum stayed with me. She peeled an apple and cut it into chunks. I ate too, she saved the rest. That night, I slept fitfully. The hum of the hospital AC, the nurse's footsteps in the hall, a patient coughing down the corridor, every sound was magnified. At 4 in the morning, I woke and stared at the grey sky through the window. Sophie and Leo would be asleep. Would Leo dream about me? Would Sophie think of me in the dark? I shook the thought away. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was just Leo's father, and that was enough. At 7, the nurse came for prep. Hospital gown, vitals, IV. My mum sat beside me, holding my hand. Her palm was damp, but her voice was steady. Don't be scared. You'll close your eyes and wake up before you know it. They wheeled me into the OR. Lights passed overhead like backward stars. The anesthesiologist lowered a mask over my face. Deep breaths. Count backward from 5. 5, 4, 3, 3. A sweet, chemical smell. Then darkness. Absolute, total, soft. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room. The window showed a grey-white sky, either dawn or dusk. A dull ache spread from my abdomen. I tried to move my fingers and found my mother's hand wrapped around mine, her head resting on the edge of the bed. I shifted slightly, and she jolted awake. You're awake! How do you feel? Are you in pain? My throat was too dry to speak. I nodded. She wet a cotton swab and dabbed my lips, then gave me a sip of water from a spoon. She buzzed the nurse, who came in to check my vitals, nodded approval, and said, Recovery looks good. I looked around the room. The pothos was still there, a little wilted. My mum had given it water. The surgery went well, she said softly. The surgeon showed me what they removed, said it looked benign, but we'll wait for pathology to confirm. I closed my eyes. The anesthetic hadn't fully worn off. I felt like I was floating, heavy and light at once. I drifted in and out of sleep, waking to sips of rice broth and the changing IV bags. By day 3, I was walking, slowly, holding the wall, shuffling down the hallway. An elderly patient in a faded hospital gown smiled at me. Young man, what did they take out? Stomach tumor. Ah, I had my gallbladder out. Don't even miss it. He patted his belly. You'll be fine. Young people bounce back. I smiled and shuffled back to my room. On day 7, they removed the stitches. The incision had healed well. Dr. Chen came in with a smile. Pathology reports in, leiomyoma, benign. Clean margins, no malignancy. Just come back for follow-up every 6 months. My mum wiped her eyes, and I let out a breath I'd been holding for over a month. The day I was discharged, I put on my own clothes, a loose hoodie and jeans. I'd lost weight, my belt needed an extra notch. The January sun felt warm on my face, and the air smelled like the end of winter. Back in my little studio, I looked at the bare white walls and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Relief. No cold silences to navigate, no whispered calls on the balcony. Just me, my meals, my recovery. I checked my phone. A flood of messages from colleagues and friends, and one from Sophie's new number. She'd deleted my old contact and added me again. Just one line. Leo keeps asking where you are. I told him you're on a work trip. He drew a picture for you. Attached was a photo. A sheet of A4 paper, crayon drawings, a crooked house with 3 stick figures beside it. Above them, 5 wobbly characters. Teen, me and Mom and Dad. The character for Dad was twice the size of the others. I stared at that picture, something hot in my chest, but I held the tears back. I typed back. Tell him Dad's working far away. I'll come see him when spring comes. Make sure he studies hard and listens to his mum. Sophie replied immediately. Okay, how are you feeling? I hesitated, then typed. Surgery's done. Benign. Recovering. Astasate. A long silence. I was about to put the phone down when another message appeared. I'm so glad. I was so worried about you." I didn't reply. Some things were better left half said. A few days later, she texted again. "I went to the hospital. They said you were discharged. Where are you staying? I want to see you. Bring you some food. Ashen." I stared at the screen. Rain had started falling, speckling the window like tiny drumbeats. I wrote, "No need. Living our own lives is the most respectful thing we can do for each other. I kept Leo's picture. Give him a kiss for me." She sent back one character. "Okay, Tazda." After that, we didn't speak for a long time. The first month after discharge, I lived like a bear in hibernation. I slept until I woke naturally, ate soft, easy things, porridge, noodles, steamed eggs, ground meat. My mum stayed 2 weeks, stuffing the fridge with supplies and teaching me to make congee in a rice cooker. Before she left, she stood at the door, weighing her words. Finally, "Ethan, health first. Everything else, leave it to fate." I knew she wanted to ask about Sophie, but she was smart. She knew when to hold back. Alone in the studio, I settled into a simple, unexciting rhythm. Read books, scrolled on my phone, walked to the market in the mornings. The neighborhood had a small park with several winter sweet trees, and when they bloomed in February, the air was sharp with a clean, honeyed scent. I'd stand beneath them, breathing deep, feeling something settle in me. Lunar New Year came. I didn't go home, didn't want the travel fatigue, didn't want to answer family questions. I hung a couplet from the supermarket, gold foil on red, stuck with double-sided tape. For the feast, I cooked a pot of chicken soup, made 2 stir-fried vegetables, and opened a bottle of juice. The TV played the Spring Festival Gala, all noise and color. I watched and ate, and when a sketch came on about a family making dumplings, I thought of last year. Leo covered in flour, Sophie laughing and wiping his nose with a wet wipe. I turned the volume up. At midnight, fireworks exploded outside, popping and cracking, a conversation of light against the dark. I stood at the window and watched. My phone buzzed, a voice message from Leo, using Sophie's phone. I tapped it, and his high little voice filled the room. "Dad, Happy New Year! I learnt so many Chinese characters. When are you coming back? I miss you." Another message, a beat later. Sophie's voice, softer than I remembered. "Ethan, Happy New Year. Leo's doing well. Don't worry." I pressed the record button, cleared my throat, and tried to sound cheerful. "Leo, Happy New Year. Dad misses you too. Learned 50 more characters, and I'll come test you, okay? Happy New Year, Mum. Eat an extra dumpling for me." I set the phone down and finished my soup, still warm, with a thin skin of oil on top. Outside, the fireworks faded, and the world grew quiet. I went back to work in March. My boss was understanding, let me telecommute, handle what I could. I opened my laptop to 200 unread emails and started responding, one by one. Work brought a rhythm back, a grounding routine. Then, one day, Sophie messaged, "Leo's school is having a parent-teacher meeting. Both parents are encouraged to attend. Could you come? Just for a little while? Hasta yay." I hesitated all night. Next morning, I replied, "What day?" "Wednesday, 3 o'clock." "Okay." Wednesday, I rode the bus 40 minutes to Leo's school. It was a small public elementary with a big sycamore tree at the gate, its branches just beginning to leaf. The afternoon sun was warm, and on the playground, kids from a PE class chased each other, laughter carrying across the field. I found the classroom on the 3rd floor. Sophie was already there, in a camel coat, her hair pulled back. She looked thinner, but her eyes had a clearer focus. She saw me and came over. "You made it." "Yeah." Leo poked his head out the door, spotted me, and shrieked. He came barreling out, wrapping his arms around my legs. "Dad, you really came!" I crouched and squeezed his cheeks. "Of course, I promised. Did you grow taller?" He stretched on his toes to show me. He had, by at least an inch. His chin was rounder too. He launched into an endless monologue about his new classmates, his test scores, the eraser his desk mate gave him. I listened and nodded, steadying him with one hand. The meeting lasted about an hour. Curriculum plans, spring trips, safety drills. Sophie sat one seat away from me. We exchanged glances, but didn't speak. Afterward, Leo dragged me to the wall where his artwork was pinned, a watercolor of a giant red crab, with his name written below in crooked letters. "Dad, do you like it?" "The red is perfect," I said. He beamed. Sophie stood nearby, watching us, her expression caught between wistfulness and gratitude. We walked out of the school together at sunset. Leo swung between us, one hand holding each of ours, jumping over sidewalk cracks. Our shadows stretched long, mingling and separating. At the bus stop, I let go of his hand. "Dad has to go. Listen to your mum. Study hard." Leo's face fell. "When will you come back?" "Soon. Next time, I'll take you to the amusement park." He squeezed my hand one last time before letting go. Sophie said, quietly, "Take care." I climbed onto the bus and found a window seat. As we pulled away, I looked back through the glass. Sophie walking Leo to her car, Leo turning to wave, Sophie turning too, just once. A brief, loaded glance. Then the bus turned the corner and they disappeared behind a row of shops. I leaned back in my seat and watched the street flow past. Spring was here. The magnolias had opened in huge white cups, covering the trees like a flock of doves. Sophie's year-end bonus came through the Friday before New Year. I heard about it through the grapevine. Manager Wang knew an old classmate of mine, and stories have a way of traveling. The amount was reportedly generous. Sophie signed the receipt, but apparently showed no pleasure. At the department lunch party that afternoon, everyone drank, sang, passed out red envelopes. Sophie slipped out after 20 minutes. Wang followed and found her in the hallway, facing the wall, shoulders shaking. "Sophie?" Wang touched her arm. "What's wrong? You just got your bonus." Sophie didn't turn around. Nothing. Just empty. Wang guessed. "Is it about your ex?" Sophie finally turned, eyes red. "Wang, I did something terrible. I left him when he needed me most." Wang sat her down, offered platitudes, asked the past, look forward. Sophie shook her head, kept repeating, "You don't understand. He didn't even complain. He just signed and said, 'Move forward.' The guilt, it's worse than if he'd screamed." Later, she said something that Wang relayed to my classmate, who relayed to me. I thought, if I asked for a divorce, he'd fight to keep me. But he didn't. He signed and walked away and told me not to look back. When I got that certificate, I realized I'd just lost the most important thing I'd ever have. Hasta luego. I heard those words while hanging laundry on the balcony in March. The sun was warm, the breeze scented with flowers. I snapped each shirt straight, draped it over the line. The wound had closed. It still itched sometimes, but it didn't hurt. In April, I got an unexpected call. Derek Zoe himself. He was polite, careful, asked if we could meet to talk. I almost declined, but when he mentioned Sophie and Leo, I agreed. We met at a quiet tea house. Derek looked older than I remembered, grey at the temples, lines etched deeper. He started with an apology. "Mr. Lin, I overstepped boundaries. I'm sorry." I sipped my tea. It's in the past. He nodded. But I want you to know, Sophie and I never had an affair. We had dinner a few times, talked about work. She kept her distance. I admit I had feelings, but she never gave in. She asked for the divorce for a different reason. I set my cup down. What reason? He paused. She told me she felt invisible in your marriage, like you were both just going through the motions. She wanted to feel wanted, and you were so steady, so patient, she couldn't even start a fight with you. When she asked for the divorce, it was partly impulse, partly a test. She thought you'd push back, show her you still cared, but you didn't. I looked at the bamboo swaying outside the window and said nothing. She regrets it, Derek continued. She submitted her resignation after her bonus. I didn't approve it, told her to take a leave instead. She's been at home, just taking care of Leo. She's lost a lot of weight. Thank you for telling me, I said. But Derek, whatever the reasons, the divorce is final. She'll find her own path, and I'll find mine. That's the only way forward. He was quiet, then extended a hand. You're right. I overstepped again. I shook his hand. Outside, the street was bright with spring light, and everyone seemed to be walking somewhere. I stepped into the air and breathed deep. The empty space in my chest was gradually filling with something warm. Summer came, and Sophie asked if I could take Leo for a few days while she visited her parents. I agreed. On a Saturday in July, she dropped him off at my apartment. He was wearing a little backpack and carrying a bag of snacks. When he saw me, he sprinted across the parking lot. Dad, I'm here! I scooped him up and swung him around. He laughed, and Sophie watched from the car, a small smile on her face. I'll pick him up in 2 days, she said. Take the afternoon train to my parents' place. Don't worry. She kissed Leo's forehead. Be good. Leo grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the building. Dad, do you have cartoons? I want to watch Peppa Pig. Sophie watched us until the elevator closed. That weekend, I took Leo everywhere. The zoo, the science museum, a water park. He swam until his fingers pruned and slept like a log at night. I sat by his bed, watching his chest rise and fall, his face round and peaceful. He could already write 100 Chinese characters, and his arithmetic was sharp. Once, while sleeping, he rolled over and mumbled, Dad. I whispered, Yeah? He didn't wake, just turned and kept sleeping. On our last evening, I took him to the small park near my building. The sunset was golden, the air heavy with grass and warmth. Leo ran ahead, chasing a butterfly. Suddenly, he stopped and turned. Dad, are you and Mum getting back together? I blinked. Why do you ask? Grandma said a family means Mum and Dad and me together, but you're always away, so it doesn't feel like a family. I crouched to his level and took his hands. Mum and Dad don't live together anymore, but we both love you. You have 2 homes now, one with Mum, one with me. Both of them are yours. He looked at me with that complicated expression children get when they're processing something too big for their age. Then, can I stay at your place more? Mum's cooking isn't as good as yours. I laughed. You'll have to ask her. He nodded seriously and ran off after the butterfly. I watched his small silhouette in the dusk, chasing light. When Sophie came back, I sent her home with a container of the pork rib soup I'd simmered. She took it, looked at me, and said, You've gained some weight. Good care, I smiled. She dipped her head. Ethan, thank you for taking care of Leo and for being decent to me, even after everything. You'll always be Leo's mother. We're family, just not that kind anymore. She nodded, got in her car, and drove off. I stood there until the white Golf disappeared into the flow of evening traffic. Summer deepened, cicadas droned outside, and the sycamores spread their leaves into thick canopies. I'd drag a lounge chair to the balcony and read, pausing to watch the sky, the clouds drifting white and slow. One night, I dreamed I was back at the county clerk's office. Sophie was holding the divorce certificate, staring at me, mouth open to speak. But before she could, I turned and walked away. When I looked back, she was gone. Just sunlit steps, empty and still. I woke at 3 a.m, the window silver with moonlight. I turned over and pulled the covers up. No ache, no ripple, just stillness. I realized then, letting go wasn't the same as forgetting. It was remembering without the wound. September came, and Leo started 2nd grade. I went to the opening ceremony, sitting in the back of the auditorium. Leo stood in line in his new uniform, red scarf at his collar, reciting the pledge with serious concentration. Sophie sat a few rows up, chatting with other parents. She glanced back once and nodded. Afterward, she walked over and handed me an envelope. "I wrote this a while ago. I never sent it, but I think you should read it." The envelope said, "Ethan Lynn," in her neat hand. I slipped it into my pocket without opening it. At home, I sat on the balcony in the afternoon sunlight and tore it open. The paper was pale blue, 3 pages dense with writing. "Ethan, Arstax. If you're reading this, it means I finally had the courage to say what I should have said to your face. Do you remember that winter night in college, standing in the snow, and you told me you wanted to be good to me? I felt like the luckiest person alive. When we got married and had Leo, we were poor, but I was content. I thought we'd stay like that forever." When did it change? Probably when I became a manager. I was drowning in work, and when I came home, all I wanted was to disappear. When you spoke to me, I felt irritated. When you made dinner, I took it for granted. I got used to your kindness the way you get used to breathing, until you stopped noticing. Then Derek came along. He made me feel important again. I let myself be flattered. I forgot I was a wife, a mother. We talked less and less, and one day I realized we barely even looked at each other anymore. I was scared, terrified that our marriage was dying, that we'd turned into hollow roommates. I didn't know how to fix it, so I made the stupidest choice possible. I asked for a divorce. I told myself, if he fights for me, he still loves me. If he lets go, it's really over. But you let go. When you said I'll sign, my heart tore. But the real break happened in that county clerk's office, when I held the certificate and watched you walk into the elevator, and I finally understood what I'd lost. I didn't lose a husband. I lost someone who'd absorbed every selfish, foolish thing I'd done and still made space for me. You didn't even ask why. After that, I was hollow. On the day I got my bonus, I felt nothing, just the image of you signing. I broke things off with Derek. I told Wang I wanted to quit. I looked at Leo and saw your face, and I'd lock myself in the bathroom and cry. Then I heard about your illness, and I wanted to slap myself. You were carrying something that huge alone, and I was making you sign divorce papers. You could have told me, used my guilt to keep me, but you didn't. You said you didn't want to trap me. Ethan, you're too good. Too good for me. Ares. I know we can't go back. You're the kind of person who, once he decides something, doesn't waver. But I still want to tell you, thank you. For not hating me. For being good to Leo. For leaving me with the last shred of dignity I had. I won't bother you anymore. I'll raise Leo to be as steady and kind as you are. Take care of yourself. Go to your follow-ups. Eat well. If one day you meet someone right, I'll be happy for you. Dasja. Leo will always be your son, and I'll always be grateful. Wishing you peace and joy. Sasha. Sophie Tast. Late summer night. When I finished the letter, the sun was setting, the sky had caught fire, layers of gold and crimson spreading across the horizon, the silhouettes of distant buildings sharp against the glow. Birds wheeled and vanished into the distance. I folded the letter, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it inside the thickest book on my shelf, the dictionary I'd kept since graduate school. Some words only need to be received. They don't demand a response. I went to the kitchen, heated a bowl of porridge, and carried it back to the balcony. The evening breeze touched my face, cool and pleasant. I thought, Sophie, we've both done our part now. What's left is up to time. Asdas. Spring came again, more than a year after the divorce. The magnolias in the neighborhood park bloomed early, heavy white cups weighing down the branches. I'd had 2 follow-ups by then, both clear. The surgeon told me I could eat more normally now, just nothing too hard or acidic. I'd filled out again, my shoulders had broadened, my face had color. Work was steady. My company had moved me to a role that fit better, remote, mostly, flexible. I went into the office once a week. Colleagues commented on how well I looked. Leo came to stay with me every weekend. I'd set up a small room for him, a bunk bed, toys on the top, blankets on the bottom. He called it his secret base. Sophie would drop him off and wait in the car until I texted, "Got him." Our communication had simplified to logistics, drop-off times, school notes, doctor appointments. No probing, no lingering. Time had done its work, not erasing the past, but softening its edges. One weekend in mid-April, I took Leo to fly kites in the park. The wind was strong, the butterfly kite shot up like a rocket, and Leo ran across the grass, laughing, the spool spinning in his hands. I watched from a bench, the sun warm on my shoulders. My phone rang. Sophie. "Are you guys at the park? I just drove by and saw your car." "Yeah, in the field. Leo's flying a kite." "I'll come over." She appeared a few minutes later, wearing a pale green coat, her hair loose. She looked well, color in her cheeks. She stood beside me, watching Leo run. "He's taller," she said. "Yeah, his pants are getting short. I need to buy him new ones." She smiled, then went quiet. Finally, "Ethan, I've decided to take a position in another city. The company offered me a transfer to their Hangzhou office. Better pay, better platform. I want to try." I turned. "What about Leo?" "Leo? I want to bring him. I've already found a good school. My mum's willing to move with us." I was quiet. Leo was 7, old enough to feel the pull of familiarity. But Sophie was right. She needed the growth, and Leo would benefit from better opportunities. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Yes." Her voice was firm but uncertain. "Does it make me selfish?" "No," I said. "You're his mother, and you're making the best decision you can for him. Hangzhou isn't far. Trains run every hour. I can visit every month. He can come back on holidays." Her shoulders relaxed. "Thank you, Ethan. We'll always be his parents. That doesn't change." Leo ran back, breathless, and spotted Sophie. "Mum, look how high my kite went." Sophie crouched to help him untangle the string, and I stood watching them, the light on their faces, the ripples of the lake beyond. That weekend, when Sophie drove off with Leo, he leaned out the window and called, "Dad, I'm going to Hangzhou with Mum. Will you miss me?" "Every single day," I said. "But we'll video call, and you'll come back for holidays. I'll take you to all the best places." He nodded, waving until the Gulf turned the corner. I stood at the gate, watching the car shrink to a speck, then vanish. I felt no sadness, only a grounded peace. Spring was unfolding in full. Peach blossoms lined the roads, petals lifting in the breeze, spinning in slow arcs before settling. I walked back past the magnolias and looked up. White blossoms against the blue, everyone open and clean. Like my life, I thought. Open, clean, ready for whatever came next. Half a year later, on an autumn weekend, I took the train to Hangzhou. Leo was waiting in the station, jumping and waving. "Dad!" He ran into my arms, and I lifted him, heavier, taller. Sophie stood a few steps back in a beige trench coat, her hair shorter, her face lit with a quiet content. "Right on time," she said. "Yeah, how's Leo adjusting?" "Great. Made friends. Grades are near the top." We walked out into the Hangzhou autumn, the air sweet with osmanthus, the sky a clear, mild blue. Leo ran ahead, narrating the layout of his new world, an anthill he'd discovered, a pancake stand near his school, a neighbour's cat with one white ear. Sophie walked beside me, her stride easy. We weren't awkward or loaded with unsaid things, just two people sharing a child, sharing a history, walking forward. That afternoon, we took Leo to West Lake. The water was still, the distant hills, hazy blue, willows trailing their pale green threads. Leo chased a ball across the grass, and Sophie and I sat on a bench, watching. She said, "Ethan, I've met someone." I looked at her. "Yeah? Who? Who?" "A university professor. History. Divorced, no kids. Kind. Good with Leo." "That's wonderful," I smiled. "You deserve that." She smiled back, more at ease than I'd seen her in years. "What about you? Anybody?" "Not yet," I stretched. "Still getting my strength back. I'll get there." She laughed. That light, easy sound I remembered from college. We'd left marks on each other, deep ones, but time had scarred them over. On the lake, a rowboat drifted by, its oars cutting quiet circles into the surface, then fading. At sunset, Leo ran over and grabbed both our hands. "Dad, Mom, let's take a picture together." Sophie and I looked at each other, then nodded. We stood together, Leo in the middle, all of us facing the dying light. Leo held up his phone, he'd learnt to use the camera, and tapped the shutter. In that photo, 3 figures in golden dusk, all smiling. Leo laughing, Sophie with a soft curve, and me with something I hadn't worn in a long time, a quiet, settled smile. I remembered that snowy night, Sophie asking me if I'd be good to her forever. I hadn't answered then, but I had now, in every small, ordinary, patient decision of the years since. Whatever happened, wherever we went, I would always be good to Leo, and I would always wish her well. That was enough. At the end of autumn, I took one last trip, back to the old house I'd sold. A young couple was renovating it. The old blue curtains had been replaced with olive green, and the ginkgo tree by the gate had turned all gold. I stood below it, watching leaves spiral down. A leaf landed on my shoulder. I picked it up, its veins perfectly etched, its color pure. I tucked it into my book and walked on. The road stretched ahead, unknown, but I was ready, for all of it, for all of it.